Thanks very, very much. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. So, I want to begin with an example. One of the difficult things about this work is you have examples of anti-Semitism, and it's difficult to know exactly the significance or the weight that should be given to any particular example. This example I give to you only for the simple reason that it happened yesterday. This is a quote from Naz Khan. Naz Khan was on the shortlist to be nominated as a Labour candidate for a local council in the north of England. And this was a quote from Naz Khan that she wrote on a website in 2012. And she wrote this. I don't know if people can see very well. She wrote, "It's such a shame that the history teachers in our school never taught us this, but they are the first to start brainwashing us and our children into thinking the bad guy was Hitler. What have the Jews done good in this world?" she said. This is 2012. And shortly after, a month or two after this, actually, after she wrote this, she made an apology and she joined a political party which was called Respect, run by somebody you might have heard of called George Galloway, which was a unity, a link between really the worst of the Trotskyist movement in Britain and a kind of Islamist communal politics in Bradford. So she apologised for this and promptly joined a party which is pretty well openly anti-Semitic nevertheless. And she said, "No, I'm not a Nazi. I'm an ordinary British Muslim that had an opinion and put it across. We have worse people in the world. We have worse people than Hitler in this world now," she said. So she apologised for the original quote. She joined the Respect Party. She hung around with George Galloway for a number of years. This week she's in the Labour Party. She's on the shortlist for a position as a councillor. And after this was put into the public domain again, she was then chosen as the Labour Party candidate in that election. Here I have an example for you which is not from yesterday but which is from last week. Again, it's up to you to judge the significance or the weight of any particular example, and of course the more examples you have, the better picture you begin to build up. This is somebody on Facebook who wrote this in response to one of the very leading people of the Union of Jewish Students in Britain, Liron Velleman, who's also a leading person in the Jewish Labour movement, which is the kind of caucus which fights against anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. And it was a very nasty kind of personal attack on Liron. "You fucking soft ute, let me explain in the best way possible to your fascist self, you Zionist fucker. The land did not belong to the Jews. It was unlawfully gifted by the British government via the fascist Balfour Declaration, which expelled all Muslims and Christians from the area to create Israel. Until now, Muslims, Christians and Jews who speak against Zionism get killed, jailed or tortured and get labelled anti-Semitic. But in the real life, Zionism is anti-Semitic. So never come against us again, or else it won't be words hitting you, it will be my fists connecting with your head top. Peace out, dickhead. Or as I know who you are, Liron, fake ute slave to the Jewish labour movement, also known as the Zionist lobby." You can probably count a number of anti-Semitic tropes in that quote. Again, what is the significance of it? I don't know. It is also a threat of physical violence. One of the senses in which this is significant is that he repeats precisely, I mean, he looks like he's a kind of activist of not a great intellect and not a very sophisticated guy. But one of the things that I've done in my book is I've kind of got an analysis, a story for anything that might happen. And I have a story and an analysis relating to this. Hannah Arendt talked about the relationship between the elite and the mob. And you might think of this guy as being somewhat of the mob. Let me give you an example of his twin in the elite. I'm going to read a little passage from my book. Alain Badiou is a Maoist philosopher, but he is nevertheless considered legitimate in anti-racist and scholarly circles. He is a celebrated and successful intellectual. He co-authored a book in 2013 called Reflections on Antisemitism, which, in the words of the publisher's webpage, dissects, quote, how facile accusations of anti-Semitism are used to stifle dissent. Gérard Bensoussan reviewed the book in Libération, arguing that in making anti-Semitism respectable, the extreme left had achieved what the far right could only dream of. He argues that Badiou participates in a contemporary restoration of French anti-Semitism. Badiou's first response is that there, quote, could be no such thing as a far-left anti-Semitism, an absurd oxymoron. You know what an oxymoron is? It's something which is kind of defined as being impossible by the words. So anything that is left could not be anti-Semitic, and anything that is anti-Semitic could not be left. It's defined out of existence using words. This is a clear illustration of the eclipse of the politics of reason by the politics of position. By definition, there can be no anti-Semitism in this place within the community of the progressive. The suggestion that there may be such a thing as left anti-Semitism is not rebutted or denied. It is met with a threatening, aggressive and emotional volley of insults, which effectively puts the person who made the suggestion outside the community. Badiou proceeds to respond with the most condescending sarcasm, implying that Bensoussan and his academic institution are well below his own Parisian intellectual and philosophical level. He says that the accusation of anti-Semitism is a matter for the courts, meaning that it is a libel. But since he places no trust in the bourgeois courts, his remedy for the libel is as follows, quote, I'll simply give Professor Bensoussan a smack in the face if I ever come across him, which will be richly deserved reward for his muck-spreading rhetoric. Badiou is clear. An accusation of anti-Semitism, if it concerns a person on the left, if it concerns something which relates to hostility to Israel, need only be responded to by violence. Reasons, evidence, or argument are appropriate for disagreements within the community of the progressive, but are not appropriate for an accuser of anti-Semitism. Now, it will be obvious to you that Badiou's response to Bensoussan is precisely the same as the guy on Facebook's response to Liron Valleman. There's a difference in kind of class, there's a difference in sophistication, but it's specifically the same response. This is Nashar. Nashar is an interesting woman. She also came from the same political background that I described earlier, the Respect Party, the kind of link between the Trotskyist left and, well, I wouldn't really call it Trotskyist, the kind of worst of the people who call themselves Trotskyists, and the Islamist communalists. Nashar also comes from Bradford, which is the same town in the north of England that the earlier example comes from. Nashar is a Labour MP, Member of Parliament, and in the spring of 2016, it came into the public domain in the right-wing newspapers that she also had been guilty of saying anti-Semitic things. They weren't on the same level as not being able to make the difficult political judgment about whether Hitler was a bad guy or not. They were more sophisticated, but still, in my judgment, they were kind of anti-Semitic. Now, what Nashar did was not threaten to punch the people who accused her. She did something else, and something quite unusual, which was she apologised. And she said, you know what, back in 2014 when I wrote that stuff, I didn't know what I was doing, I didn't understand the politics I was involved with, and I want to learn. And I'm really, really sorry. It wasn't a politician's apology which says, I'm sorry if anybody was offended. It seemed like a proper apology. She went to the local synagogue and had a 3-hour discussion with 60 or 70 people there. She sought out people who she could have a proper discussion with, one of whom was me. I had a long discussion with Naz Shah. So she's kind of unusual because she took this seriously. As she apologised, Ken Livingston, who is quite a mainstream, well-known figure on the British left, who had been Mayor of London and he'd been the leader of the Greater London Council, who's been around a long time. As Naz Shah was apologising, Ken Livingston was going around the TV stations and the radio stations insisting that she had nothing to apologise for. He was kind of mansplaining. You've heard the word mansplaining. He was mansplaining Naz Shah. He was saying she's got nothing to apologise for. She was absolutely right. And he sort of related to one of the things that she'd said during the Gaza conflict that was problematic. And he suddenly started talking about Hitler as well. Ken Livingston said Hitler was supporting Zionism before he went mad. Hitler was a Zionist. And this is a political discourse that Ken Livingston has been associated with for a good 30, 40, 50 years, actually. The premise is very simple. The premise says that Nazis thought that Jews couldn't live in Europe and had to go elsewhere, and Zionists agreed that Jews couldn't live within Europe and had to go elsewhere. And the political punch of the Nazism and Zionism allegation is that the Zionists are kind of as bad as the Nazis and are kind of were in league with the Nazis. Ken Livingston was put on a charge of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party, and he went to a tribunal within the party. And on the steps of the tribunal, he was filmed by the TV cameras saying things like this: the SS set up training camps so that German Jews who were going to go there could be trained to cope with a very different sort of country when they got there. I don't know how this... I mean, look, this sounds completely mad in Britain, right? I don't know how it sounds here. I imagine it sounds probably even madder. You have to understand that, Livingston is kind of obsessed politically with Nazism and the fight against Nazism and Nazis as a kind of symbol of everything bad in the world. And that's why he wants to portray Israel and the Jews as being connected to it. I have to say, I've been doing this a long time, and sometimes I become a little bit desensitized to this stuff. And one should actually remember just how awful, how horrible this allegation is. The allegation that the people who were trying to organise for Jews to escape and to defend themselves are the same politically as the people who were trying to murder the Jews. It's a horrible allegation. This is also what Ken Livingston said on the steps of his tribunal. When the Zionist movement asked, would the Nazi government stop the rabbis doing their sermons in Yiddish and make them do it in Hebrew, he agreed to that. Does that sound plausible? Does it sound plausible that Hitler went to the synagogues in the 1930s and said, no Yiddish, you have to speak Hebrew because you're preparing for the land of Israel? It doesn't sound plausible, it's not plausible, and it's not true. Ken Livingston was relying on a certain little coterie of kind of pseudo-historians. If you want to read the specific rebuttals of this stuff, Paul Bogdanar, who's a historian, has put them all together, but you shouldn't need to. Because what you should need to do is to say, well, This is completely mad. Hitler wanted to kill the Jews, the Zionists wanted to organise the Jews to save themselves. Different kind of politics. Livingston also said this: they passed a law that said that only the Zionist flag and the swastika were the only flags that could be flown in Germany. Does that sound reasonable to you? And then, of course, they started selling Mauser pistols to the underground Jewish army. This was all Ken Livingston's defence on the steps of his tribunal. This was 30 years before, in the 1980s, when Ken Livingston had been the editor of a left-wing newspaper called Labour Herald. This was the kind of cartoon that he published. He's been doing this for a long time. Now, the thing I need to tell you about Livingston is that he's quite well liked, and he's quite mainstream. And this wasn't some complete lunatic crank. Well, actually, it was complete lunatic cranks feeding him this stuff, which he then repeated. Let me introduce you to Moshe Machover. Moshe Machover is an Israeli Trotskyist who has been in London for a very long time. And Machover is one of the so-called experts who was influential on Ken Livingston, and actually was influential at the beginning of this anti-Zionist resurrection, renaissance, whatever you want to call it, in Britain in the early 1980s, late 70s, early 80s. Machover had written an article which was sent around Labour Party conference this year as a leaflet. And in the article he said Ken Livingston was absolutely right, Hitler supported Zionism, and here's the proof. And he dug up this quote from Reinhard Heydrich. People might know who Reinhard Heydrich was. He was one of the leading Nazis. He organised the killing of 1 million or 2 Jews as the Nazi armies went across Russia. And the quote that Machover dug up was this, from 1935, quote, "National Socialism has no intention of attacking the Jewish people in any way." And this is evidence that until later, the Nazis were simply Zionists. Now, I want to be kind of clear about this, because I'm not saying that Moshe Machover is a supporter of Reinhard Heydrich or of Hitler or whatever. What I'm saying is that he mobilised this quote, this truth from Heydrich, in order to use it against the actually existing Jewish labour movement today at Labour Party conference. That's what was going on here. If anybody's interested in what Hitler actually said about Zionism, let me give you this quote from Mein Kampf. "While the Zionists try to make the rest of the world believe that the national consciousness of the Jew finds its satisfaction in the creation of a Palestinian state, the Jews again slyly dupe the dumb Goyim. It doesn't even enter their heads to build a Jewish state in Palestine for the purpose of living there. All they want is a central organisation for their international world swindler endowed with its own sovereign rights and removed from the intervention of other states, a haven for convicted scoundrels and a university for budding crooks." But you didn't need me to tell you that it was fake, this idea that the Nazis were Zionists. So why do people do it? Why is it so important to people like Moshe Machover, Ken Livingston, people who really, who've studied this for years? Why is it important to them? It's important to them to say that Israel and its ideas and its foundation are amongst the very worst things on the planet. Moshe Machover, in the same leaflet that went around Labour Party conference, also wrote this: "The whole campaign of equating opposition to Zionism with anti-Semitism has in fact been carefully orchestrated with the help of the Israeli government and the far right in the United States. It is easy to explain why, he says. So we've already seen this kind of discourse earlier on in this talk. And what Mathover is saying very clearly is that the people who are opposing anti-Semitism at this year's Labour Party conference don't really belong there. Because really, they are organising in cahoots with, orchestrated with the Israeli government and the far right in the United States. Not the right, not the Americans, but the far right. And the point of this quote, the point that Mathover is trying to make is that when you see somebody raising the issue of anti-Semitism and saying, I'm really worried, what he wants you to then think is, these people are not really part of our discussion. They're not really part of the Labour Party. They're from outside. These people are right-wingers, representatives of a foreign state, representatives of the American right. So this is a way, again, of putting us outside of the community, first of the oppressed and then of the progressive. In precisely the same way that the previous examples, which said, if you accuse me of anti-Semitism, I'm just going to hit you. This example says, if you accuse me of anti-Semitism, I'm going to assume that you're an agent of a foreign power and you're not really British and you're not really at home on the left or in the Labour movement. Here's a story that happened to me on Facebook. There was a discussion about the rise of Jeremy Corbyn. Let me just briefly explain to you the weirdness of the rise of Jeremy Corbyn. I've known him for a long time. He was a Labour MP in one North London constituency. I'll say a little bit more about his politics. He comes from a kind of Stalinist, Communist Party politics. He has supported every kind of, I don't know what to call it, sort of far-left campaign. He was a patron of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, which is a campaign which pushes for the boycott of Israel. He was a patron of the Stop the War campaign, which says that there's only one war and it needs to be stopped, and that's the war of imperialism against the rest of the world. He was a supporter of the Republican movement in Ireland and particularly the terroristic wing of that. For reasons which are quite complicated and which maybe we can talk about more, he suddenly came into the mainstream and he won the election to become leader of the Labour Party. It was a real surprise to everybody, not least him, and it was a very strange moment. So this discussion was, somebody had said on Facebook that they were really worried about his sudden rise into the leadership. And somebody who I used to know actually a long time ago, I kind of know his name, I don't know if he knows me or not. He wrote this: you have to respect Jeremy's mandate, right? You have to respect the fact that he won the election. You have to respect his mandate. And I said it's about politics. It's about authoritarian politics. It's about anti-Semitism. It's about working for press TV. It isn't about going with the majority. It's not simply about the massive mandate. And the response was very simple. I stopped reading when you called Jeremy an anti-Semite. I stopped. And he disappeared. And that was the end of the discussion. So if you raise the issue, you put yourself outside of the community which is allowed to discuss these issues. This is Len McCluskey. He's the leader of the most powerful trade union in Britain. And he wrote this: the row over anti-Semitism within the Labour Party is nothing more than a cynical attempt to challenge Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. In other words, there's nothing to it. It's completely fake. It's raised by people who aren't really interested in anti-Semitism at all, but they're simply interested in challenging this new leader of the Labour Party. It's a conspiracy. It's a fake. It's the people who say that they're worried about anti-Semitism really aren't worried at all. They're really involved in something else. And this little rhetorical device is something that I, quite a long time ago, named the Livingston Formulation. Ken Livingstone put it like this: for far too long, the accusation of anti-Semitism has been used against anyone who is critical of the policies of the Israeli government, as I have been. So again, the same claim. There's two parts to this claim. The first is that it's not an accusation that we're just mistaken. It's not an accusation that we made a mistake. It's not an accusation that we've misjudged the evidence or the argument. It's an accusation that we know what we're doing, right? The accusation has been used against anyone who is, and then we have a conflation of everything into this category of criticism, critical of the policies of the Israeli government. Israel is like Hitler. Israel should be boycotted. Israel is apartheid. Israeli Jewish societies on campus should be banned. Zionism is racism. All of these things get conflated into this category of criticism. And here we have two graphical illustrations of the Livingston Formulation. The top one has the world trying to protest against the crimes of Israel and having its mouth shut by this Jewish allegation of anti-Semitism. And the bottom one shows an activist also wanting to say free Palestine, but having his mouth shut by this allegation of anti-Semitism. I'm not sure who's doing the shutting here, because we don't see the person who's doing the shutting. The only thing we know about this person is that their left sleeve is Israel, and their right sleeve is the United States of America. So who is the person? Think about it. The interesting thing about these cartoons is that they were written by Latuf, who's a Brazilian cartoonist who won the third prize in President Ahmadinejad's Holocaust Denial Cartoon Competition, which he set up after you remember the kind of discussion in Denmark over the publication of cartoons which showed the Prophet Muhammad in graphical form, and Ahmadinejad said, well, if you can blaspheme against our religion, then we'll blaspheme against yours. And what's your religion? Talking to you, the West. Your religion is the Holocaust. So I'm going to encourage people to make cartoons about the Holocaust. Latuf is also, you might see, if you're interested in anti-Zionist websites and publications and the rest of it, you will come across Latuf. Now that I've told you who he is, you'll come across him. And you'll come across him amongst anti-racist publications and websites and individuals. And it's interesting and I think significant that his work is loved both by people like Ahmadinejad, for whom the distinction between being against Jews and being against Israel is unimportant. And it's also liked by people who say that the distinction between being against Jews and being against Israel is very important. Here's another example. Jenny Tong was famous for having said, the Israel lobby has its grips on the Western world. And if you didn't quite understand what she meant, she went on to say, it's financial grips, the Israel lobby. Now, the Israel lobby was a term offered by a couple of professors from the United States, from the Kennedy School of Government, Mearsheimer and Walt, and Chicago, I think. And it was an argument that the worst and most kind of important thing in American politics at that time, which was the Iraq War, the biggest disaster in American politics, was actually created by what they called the Israel lobby. And their argument was that the whole of American capital, the American state, American power was manipulated by the Zionist lobby in order to send it to war against its own interests, but in the interests of Israel. Now think about it. There are, 12 million Jews in the world. The argument is that they were in a conspiracy to force America to act against its own interests. Anyway, so Jenny Tong does this thing about the whole of the Western world has, the Israel lobby has its grips on the Western world, and when the issue of anti-Semitism is raised, she says this: I'm sick of being accused of anti-Semitism when what I am doing is criticising Israel and the state of Israel. So again, exactly the same formulation. She doesn't say, I think you're wrong and let's discuss it. She doesn't say, oh yeah, that did sound a bit like conspiracy theory, maybe I should rethink that. She says, this is a conspiracy. I'm sick of being accused of anti-Semitism when what I'm doing is criticising Israel. This is David Duke, who's, again, used to be the leader of the Ku Klux Klan, a kind of open racist. And he uses exactly the same form of denial. It is perfectly acceptable to criticise any nation on earth, but lo and behold, don't you dare criticise Israel, for if you do that, you will be accused of anti-Semitism. Now, here's my book. I have lots of copies here, which you can buy for €20. The story of the book is really a story of how some of these ideas moved from the kind of extreme left periphery of politics, of discussion, into the mainstream. This is Malia Bouattia, who won the election for the president of the National Union of Students in 2016. She believes she's an opponent of the peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians. She says that the peace process itself is actually part of strengthening the colonial project. She opposes boycotts, divestment and sanctions on the basis that they are non-violent. And she says that we should be careful to teach people to support what she calls Palestinian violent resistance and not to make people sort of satisfied with boycotts. She talks about the mainstream media, the mainstream Zionist-led media. She referred to Birmingham University, which had quite a strong Jewish society, as a Zionist outpost. So she was quite an unpleasant character who embodied a lot of this kind of anti-Zionist politics, and more so, really. She was the president of NUS. This is Jeremy Corbyn. Now, I've said a lot of things about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party so far, and I've told you the ways in which it is denied. So maybe I'm wrong, and maybe the people who are angry about these sort of allegations of anti-Semitism are right. Well, let's have a look at some of the things in Jeremy Corbyn's own political tradition and in his own past, and let's make a judgment on that. It's well known that Jeremy Corbyn referred to Hamas and Hezbollah as friends. Hamas is quite a complicated organisation. It's a Palestinian nationalist organisation. It's also the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. Its foundational document, its constitution, repeats a whole number of explicitly anti-Semitic tropes. It says that the enemy began by creating the French Revolution and was responsible for the First World War and the Second World War and the Boer War. And it says that they plan to kill the Jews. And it says that they believe that peace processes are a violation of the fundamental tenets of Islam, peace with the occupiers. So it's a complicated organisation. Hezbollah is a similar in some ways organisation. For the last 4 or 5 years, Hezbollah has been paid and financed by the Iranians to support the Assad government in Syria in its war against the Syrian people. Many hundreds of thousands of people have been killed by those forces, including Hezbollah. and millions have been displaced and pushed out. Many of them outside of the borders in Syria, many of them within the borders of Syria. So Corbyn referred to these guys as friends. Now, when challenged with that, he kind of wriggled out of it a little bit, and he said, look, I'm for peace, I'm for dialogue, I'm for talking with these people, I'm for facilitating the Israelis and the Palestinians coming together and talking. I had them in the room, I was being polite. It was diplomatic language, so I talked to, my friends from Hamas, my friends from Hezbollah. It's all vaguely plausible. Until you look at the second half of the quote. Corbyn is talking about Hamas and Hezbollah, and he says, and the idea that an organisation that is dedicated towards the good of the Palestinian people and bringing about long-term peace and social justice and political justice in the whole region. If I said to you that I thought that the Ku Klux Klan was dedicated to the good of the American South, you wouldn't have much trouble in understanding that I was a supporter of the Ku Klux Klan, would you? This was Jeremy Corbyn's politics. How is that possible? How is it possible for somebody on the left, an anti-racist, a good guy, how is it possible for him to think that these anti-Semitic movements, these Jew-killing movements, are for the good of the Palestinian people and for peace and justice across the Middle East? How is this possible? And how is it possible that this man was then elected leader of the Labour Party? I think the way to understand how it's possible is this. I think many people on the left, and also many of the intellectuals, the radical intellectuals, have built a worldview which is really different from a kind of classical Marxist worldview or from a kind of classical political economy or politics of modernity. And what they say is this. They say that there is a machine across the world, and they call it capitalism, or they call it imperialism, or they call it modernity, and that machine creates misery and poverty and violence and slavery. And you should keep your eye on the ball, right? The real aggressor on the planet is capitalism, modernity, imperialism, and they will try to tell you sometimes that other people are worse, that ISIS or Al-Qaeda or Hamas or even Hitler are worse. But keep your eye on the ball, because the real violence, the real aggressor is this global system, this iron cage of capitalism. And within that framework, anybody who is against capitalism, or anyone who says that they don't like imperialism or that they're against modernity, is then in some sense on our side, on the side of the oppressed, on the side of the left, on the side of the radicals, against the real aggressor, which is this global American, European system of imperialism. As I said, this is a really radical departure, for example, from Marx. When I teach Marx to our first-year sociologists, the first thing I tell them is that Marx really loved capitalism. And they go, huh? Really? Are you sure? And I say, absolutely. Marx loved capitalism. He thought it was the most productive, dynamic, exciting system that the world had ever seen. He thought it created the productive forces and the technology which made a new world possible. He thought it created democratic politics. He thought it created the rational state. He thought it created the rule of law. Marx thought capitalism was incredible and it made something else possible. And there's a dialectic in modernity, that capitalism had kind of outlived its possibility and in the end was going to create an even better system. Capitalism was going to create its own gravediggers and was going to become something even more democratic, even more universal, even more liberating. This is not the same worldview as the Soviet worldview, which said socialism is good and capitalism, imperialism, modernity is bad. I've explained to you half the story, the worldview. What I haven't explained to you, and what I find really difficult to explain to you, and what I would love to be able to explain to you, is how that system of global imperialism, capitalism, modernity gets pictured as having Israel as its most important and central point. Because it often is. And as a sociologist, I would really like to be able to explain to you the existence of anti-Semitism in relation to something other than previous anti-Semitism. And I have trouble doing that. Anti-Semitism always put the Jews at the centre of everything that was wrong with the world. And some people have this global view of imperialism, and they understand Israel to be a kind of keystone of this system. You know what a keystone is? It's if you have a brick arch, it's a special shaped stone in the top of the arch, which is shaped so that the arch doesn't fall down. Jeremy Corbyn jumped to the defence of Raad Salah. Raad Salah was a leader of a Palestinian town in Israel. This was what Raad Salah had to say that upset many people. We have never allowed ourselves to knead the dough for the bread that breaks the fast in the holy month of Ramadan with children's blood. He said, whoever wants a more thorough explanation, let him ask what used to happen to some children in Europe whose blood was mixed in with the dough of the holy bread. This is criticism of Israel, yes? Nah, not really. This is classic blood libel. The traditions of anti-Semitism, there are two kind of central traditions of anti-Semitism. One is blood libel, which begins by saying that the Jews murdered Jesus, the Jews murdered God, which is the kind of most evil thing you could possibly do. And in murdering God, they not only destroyed their own chance of redemption, but they destroyed all of our chances of redemption, right? So the Jews in their crime not only prevented them from coming to universal heavenly peace, it also prevented all of us. And says the blood libel, the Jews reenact this crime on the body of non-Jewish children. And they take the blood and they use it for their ritual purposes. This is one of the old elements of anti-Semitism. The other one, by the way, we've already seen, is conspiracy theory. And of course, if you require the murder of non-Jewish children for your holy rituals, you'd better have a pretty good conspiracy to hush it all up as well. So blood libel and conspiracy go together. Jeremy Corbyn said about Raad Salah, Salah is far from a dangerous man. And he said he would like to invite Raad Salah to come and take tea with him on the terrace of the House of Commons. How is that possible? It's possible if you think that the key thing is the global system of modernity, capitalism, imperialism, and you think the key allies are the people who oppose it, and you think that's the important thing, and if you think that a little bit of anti-Semitism is kind of understandable when you're occupied by the Jews. So it's a worldview. This is Stephen Sizer. He's a Church of England vicar. And he's a kind of one of these guys who's had a real obsession about the evils of Israel for many, many years. This was a quote. You can't see the quote because it's too little. From 2007, for example, and there are lots of these from Sizer. The Synod, the Parliament of the Church, wrote Sizer, would not be... I can't even read it from here. Doesn't matter. I should be able to know this because I wrote...
Intimidated.
Yes, if I come a little bit further. The Synod would not be intimidated by those who cry anti-Semitism whenever Israel human rights abuses in the occupied territories are mentioned. We recognise this already, yes? the idea that you cry anti-Semitism in order to silence criticism of Israel. So as it goes on, why has the Archbishop, the head of the church, faced a torrent of criticism over, and it was about a plan to boycott Caterpillar, which was said to provide the bulldozers that helped the occupation and house demolitions and stuff like that. So it was a plan to boycott Caterpillar. Why has the Archbishop faced a torrent of criticism? Simple. The people in the shadows know that Caterpillar is only the first. Who are the people in the shadows? I suspect people in the shadows is the same guy who has one hand that's Israeli and one hand that's American that you don't see in Lettuce's picture. The people in the shadows know that Caterpillar is only the first. Let justice roll. Sizer did a lot of this, and I know a number of Christians who followed his career, who can tell you many, many examples like this that were highly problematic. Jeremy Corbyn jumped to his defence and wrote a letter to the church saying that Sizer is the victim of a smear by the Israel lobby. You see, you raise the issue of anti-Semitism, and the answer is you're just trying to silence criticism of Israel. In the end, as often happens, Sizer gave the game away when he put on Facebook 9/11, Israel did it, and he pasted an article which explained that 9/11 was a false flag operation by the Israeli government for its own purposes. The Israeli government murdered 3,000 people in the World Trade Center in order to push the United States to follow its interests in the Middle East. This is Jeremy Corbyn on Press TV. Press TV is the propaganda outfit of the Iranian state. Corbyn earned quite a lot of money, I think 20 or 30,000 pounds, hosting borderline anti-Semitic programs in an anti-Semitic TV station. So when I told you that people who raise the issue of anti-Semitism are told that there's nothing to it, I'm hoping that I'm beginning to show you that there's something to it. There's a case to answer. There's something going on. And that this standard response, which says there's nothing there, you're only doing this because you're anti-left, you're anti-British, you're anti-Corbyn, you want to silence criticism of Israel, is a problem. This is an op-ed piece that was written by Yasmin Alabai-Brown in the Independent newspaper. Headline, "Fling mud if you must, but don't call Jeremy Corbyn an anti-Semite." It doesn't say if you think he's anti-Semitic, you're wrong and this is why. It just says don't do it, you're prohibited from doing it. It is an accusation that is both absurd and menacing. The right, Blairites and hard Zionists. Any hard Zionists here or just Zionists? Yeah, one or two. Have formed the most unholy of alliances. Unholy is an interesting word in this context. The most unholy of alliances to slay the reputation of the next likely leader of the Labour Party. Most depressing of all is the collusion between the powerful right and Zionists. Not hard Zionists anymore, just Zionists in general, and the powerful right. Why would Zionists be in collusion with the powerful right? Some Zionists are right-wing, aren't they? And some Zionists are left-wing, and some Zionists are... Israel is a nation. Why would a whole nation be in collusion with one set of politics? They seem determined to crush all alternatives to neoliberal economics. What? Who? The Blairites, the Zionists, the hard Zionists are determined to crush all alternatives to neoliberal economics and Western hegemony. Why would they be? Do you remember the keystone? The idea that Israel is at the very centre of this global system, which is the real aggressor. And this woman is now saying that the Zionists and the hard Zionists are really worried about any threat to Western hegemony and about neoliberal economics. And then she goes on, as Stephen Sizer did with his Men in the Shadows, as the forces of darkness turn on Corbyn, the leadership contest continues its descent into a passion play. What's a passion play? A passion play is a representation of the killing of Jesus that's put on at Easter. And very often passion plays are a retelling of the anti-Semitic version of the killing of Jesus. So what's she saying now? She's saying the leadership contest continues its descent into a passion play, a play in which the Jews are trying to murder Jesus Christ, JC, Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, it's kind of mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling what she was thinking when she wrote this. It's not on the internet anymore. I don't know why. It's hard to Google, but fortunately the quote is in my book. I've got lots more material. I could talk all night, but I'm not going to, don't worry. I'm going to give you 3 quotes that are interesting. And then I think I'm going to allow people to ask questions and see if I can address what you're thinking more than what I'm thinking. This is a theorist of the Socialist Workers' Party. They're the people that I said were Trotskyists, and then I kind of changed my mind in defence of Trotskyism and said that they were the kind of worst of the Trotskyist movement. This is what Molyneux wrote in 2006. Quote, an illiterate, conservative, superstitious Muslim Palestinian peasant. There's a nice little nest of stereotypes for you, one on top of the other. Who supports Hamas is more progressive than an educated, liberal, atheist Israeli who supports Zionism even critically. Wow. What we learn from that is that what you think and what you do and what you say is less important for John Molyneux than your position objectively within this global struggle of forces between the progressive and the anti-progressive. And this is a kind of characteristically totalitarian notion. The idea that you are an enemy objectively, not because of what you say or do, but because of how you fit into the world. And I find this quite worrying. This is Seamus Milne. Seamus Milne is an old Communist Party member, was a columnist in the Guardian newspaper, mainstream liberal newspaper. I mean, really, you know, some people were Communist Party members until Stalin starved the Ukrainians in 1930, whatever it was. And some people left in the Doctor's Plot. And some people left the Communist Party in 1956 when they invaded Hungary. And some people left the Communist Party in 1968 when they invaded Prague. And some people left the Communist Party when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989. Not Seamus. Seamus was still there in the late 20s. You know, 26, 27, 2010. He's now one of Jeremy Corbyn's key advisors. And this is what he wrote in, is there a date, also in 2006. Quote, Hamas and the support it attracts is only the current expression of a spirit of Palestinian national resistance to oppression and dispossession going back decades. So if you say the people who support Hamas support an anti-Semitic movement, it's anti-Semitic in its very founding statement. The white boy from London retranslates that for you. And he says, don't worry about what they say. They don't know what they say. They're just, you know, peasants, right? Don't worry about what they say. Worry about who they are. And who they are is simply the current expression of this kind of timeless force of Palestinian resistance, which is a democratic force and an anti-imperialist force. It's really quite it's quite disrespectful to Hamas, really, isn't it? Hamas say we want to kill the Jews. And Seamus says, no, they don't want to kill the Jews, they just want a democratic and secular state in the whole of Palestine. And Hamas says, no, we want to kill the Jews. And it's it's a similar kind of politics, a kind of objectivist, totalitarian notion. This is Moishe Postone. Moishe is a Marxist critical theorist in Chicago, a professor, quite well known, quite well liked amongst many people on the German left, I believe. And he writes this: anti-Semitism can appear to be anti-hegemonic. Right? There is an authentically left-wing tradition of anti-Semitism. And when I say authentically left-wing, what I mean is it's not just a kind of anti-foreigner, right-wing, the people who don't like having Jews or foreigners or Turks or Arabs in their golf club. It's not that. It's a kind of authentically left-wing in the sense that so the left looks at the world and it says there are things really bad about the world and we want to change the world and we want to understand what's bad about it. And the left has often been attracted and tempted by conspiracy theory, by theories which look at why there are these big structural power imbalances in the world, why men are in charge and white people are in charge and rich people are in charge, and it's easy to explain it in terms of conspiracy theory. And conspiracy theory is always very close to anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Marxism, on the other hand, tried to create a scientific account of why there were these big structures of power, and in particular why these big structures of power came out of a time which was more equal, when people could buy and sell their labour as they wanted, and when people were free citizens. And why that... So Marxism created a kind of an attempt to make a scientific understanding of society in order to undercut conspiracy theory. I mean, sociology too, Durkheim and Weber and these guys were interested in trying to understand power differences, not by reference to conspiracy. You will notice that many people who consider themselves to be Marxists are actually conspiracists. It's quite difficult. Again, when I'm teaching my first-year students, you explain them this stuff, and you explain to them that Marx tried to have a kind of scientific structural theory of how it works. And then they write you essays which say the bourgeoisie are really horrible and greedy and they oppress the working class because they want to take all their money. It's easy to make that mistake, and lots of people do it. So, anti-Semitism can appear to be anti-hegemonic. This is the reason why a century ago August Bebel, one of the great German socialists, characterised anti-Semitism as the socialism of fools. Given its subsequent development, it could also have been called the anti-imperialism of fools, as a fetishised form of oppositional consciousness. What? Fetishised form. You know what a fetish is, right? When you have all these kind of sexual feelings which you focus onto one little thing which is kind of inappropriate, like a shoe or a piece of rubber or something, right? A fetish is when you put all these feelings and desires onto one thing where it doesn't really belong, right? When you have an oppositional consciousness which focuses on the Jews, which puts your whole consciousness somewhere that it doesn't really belong. I have no judgment about rubber or shoes or whatever, by the way, but your oppositional consciousness doesn't belong on the Jews. It is particularly dangerous because it appears to be anti-hegemonic, the expression of a movement of the little people against an intangible global form of domination. It is as a fetishised, profoundly reactionary form of anti-capitalism that I would like to begin discussing the recent surge of modern anti-Semitism in the Arab world. Let me just think what else I have for you. How long have I spoke? How long have I spoken for students of English?
About an hour.
Oh, okay, that's enough. I'm going to stop and I'm going to invite people to ask me questions and we can have a discussion. I'm going to show you all the lovely things you missed. Oh, I might come back to that at the end, actually. Anyway, find me on Facebook, find me on Twitter, and buy my book for €20. And now ask me whatever you want to ask me, and I'm happy to carry on. Thank you. Yes.
Sometimes I get the sense that the left also is somewhat against religion. Anti-Semitism could be a form of their argument against religion.
Yes.
And maybe even against a single state religion, or a single state based on religion. Like
Yes.
They don't have the same attack against Arab states that are also mono-religion and also, in a sense, dictatorships. I don't understand why that never comes up.
Okay, well, there is a classic left critique of religion, right, which is very simple, which is that God doesn't exist. And therefore, they kind of argue that religion is a kind of creation of pre-capitalism and of capitalism, which tries to actually to fetishize your consciousness somewhere else from where it belongs. So there's a perfectly kind of respectable left critique of religion. So there was a really interesting debate between Karl Marx and Bruno Bauer in Germany in the early 1840s. And Bruno Bauer was a kind of radical, right? He was a bit like the guys we've been talking about today. And Bruno Bauer said, yeah, the Jews should have emancipation, but what they really need to do is emancipate themselves from their own religion and from their own traditions, and they ought to come into the modern world and they ought to adopt rational thinking instead of all this silly religious thinking and these beards and all this stuff. And they should emancipate themselves from religion, and when they've done that, then they can join us in the socialist project to emancipate all of us from capitalism and from the modern state. And Marx came along, and in fact Marx was asked by the Jewish community in Germany at that time to write a petition for the emancipation of the Jews, a petition which would say that the Jews should have equal rights in the German state, in other words, that the German state should become a democratic state. And Marx said to Bauer, no. He said, Jews have rights. And he didn't disagree that actually people should emancipate themselves from religion, but what he said was that their emancipation in the state, their democratic rights, were completely independent of what they chose to believe. That they could be emancipated into a democratic state without having to change themselves first. And this was really important, and it goes back to what I was saying before. Marx believed in rights, and he didn't make rights conditional on your own, what your own religion or other aspects of your identity. The critique of rights from the left comes from much later, comes from the Stalinists. And of course, the Stalinists who ran the Soviet Union didn't believe in rights because they wanted to run a state in which people didn't have rights. So they said that human rights are just a kind of bourgeois fiction which are invented in order to keep people, in order to pretend that there's a justification for oppressing them. This was nonsense, and this wasn't Marx's position. So what I'm trying to get at in quite a roundabout way and answer your question is that the critique of religion has been used many times before as a way of particularly getting at the Jews. And Marx himself had a really clear critique of that. And it's a kind of universal... So people on the left like universalism, right? We like the idea that everyone has equal rights. We like the idea that every human being is in some sense of equal value. But universalism can also be mobilised against the particular. And Bauer mobilised the idea of universalism against the Jews by saying that they shouldn't have democratic rights until they have emancipated themselves from their Judaism. And there's a parallel to that, which is that the Jews today in Israel are kind of told that they don't really have rights until they abandon their own particularity and their own nationhood and become part of the universal brotherhood of human beings. Of course, the Israelis have perfectly reasonable reasons to think that the ability to defend themselves might be quite important. You know, you've heard, it's often said that that the only people who didn't learn from World War II were the Jews. And we all learned, right? We all learned the lessons of Hitler. We all learned the lessons of Nazism and colonialism, and we built this lovely new democratic Europe in which everybody has rights and which nation states are kind of got rid of. And the only people who didn't learn the lesson were the Jews, who went back to this ethnic nationalism, who went back to this kind of Nazism, as Machover and Livingston would have it. Seems to me that actually, well, firstly, the Holocaust wasn't a university. It wasn't a learning experience. So the idea that Jews should have learned from that, I think, is kind of odd. But more importantly, the lessons that many Jews learnt, that they cannot rely on the international community to protect their rights, and that they would be better off having an army and powerful friends, is not a kind of, you know, you might agree with it, you might disagree with it, but it's not crazy, is it? And if you look even in the last 2 years, what's happened to minorities in the Middle East who didn't have the right to defend themselves, it seems to me that the Israelis are not irrational to want that. Yeah?
We're talking here about the anti-Semitism among the British left.
Sorry. Go on.
When we think about anti-Semitism, I think about Poland in Europe,
Yeah.
Poland, France,
Yeah.
Spain, maybe Germany, of course. But English doesn't, they never had pogroms or anything. It has never been such a big topic, England, anti-Semitism, as far as I know. So do you think it's something new, has risen recently, or is it something which was always similar?
Yeah. So one of the things about this kind of anti-Semitism is that it's an anti-Semitism pushed and defended by people who believe that they are opponents of anti-Semitism. Right? They're not pogromists. They're not people who go around beating up Jews and burning down synagogues. That's not what this is. This is a kind of political anti-Semitism. And it's a political anti-Semitism which has been present for a long time, but it's been very marginal. I mean, unless you count the Soviet Union and East Germany and Poland. Somebody came to me during one of the battles about the boycott. There was a proposal to boycott Israeli academics, to prevent Israeli academics from coming to British campuses. And somebody came to me, Polish guy, and he said, this reminds me absolutely of what happened to my father in Poland in 1968. And I was ignorant. I didn't even know what happened in 1968 in Poland. But the Jewish intellectuals were challenged to state their opposition to Israeli imperialism. And if they didn't do it in terms which satisfied the state, they were kicked out of their jobs. And the same happened also in East Germany around about the same time. So this is a political anti-Semitism. And it is really odd. You know, people... even at this very moment, I feel a bit mad coming to you and telling you that there's this great big problem in Britain. Even after I've shown it to you, I've demonstrated it to you, I've written a book about it, I still find it quite odd. I kind of suspect myself. And I suspect that the things that my opponents say to me are true and that I'm just trying to silence criticism of Israel, whatever. but the examples are too common. And they make sense in a kind of political universe, which I've tried to describe.
But it's not a cultural anti-Semitism. Like you can say in Poland
Yeah.
or France, it's a cultural anti-Semitism, which has a very, very long history.
Well, I think that's true. But there's also a history of political anti-Semitism. It's just not one we're really used to. What we're really used to understanding is somebody who wears a Nazi uniform as an anti-Semite, and if you're not that kind of anti-Semite, then you're not anti-Semitic. The other thing I would say is that this phenomenon plays out differently in different places. This phenomenon is centrally about a symbolic way of defining your political identity. So at the moment, people who are supporters of Corbyn and supporters of the left are using this issue to define their political identity. In England, so I remember a trade union leader getting really angry when somebody suggested that boycotts were connected to anti-Semitism. And he said, "How dare you?" He said, "We saved the Jews." Right? And what he meant by that was Britain. Britain saved the Jews in the Holocaust, and how dare you accuse us of being anti-Semitic? And it's true that in Britain there's no Holocaust guilt, but in fact the Brits consider themselves to be the heroes of the Holocaust. But there is colonial guilt. So in Britain, this way of thinking about and defining your identity is much more swayed by colonial guilt than by Holocaust guilt. In Germany, I suspect it's precisely the other way round. In France, we have Algeria and Vichy, right? So we have this kind of mixture of both colonial guilt and Holocaust guilt, and the Jews and the Arabs come from Algeria and they live in the same neighbourhoods of Paris, and everything gets quite complicated. In South Africa, it's all about apartheid. So in South Africa, Israel is used as a kind of symbol, a representation of the apartheid struggle, and the anger which is focused on Israel is really about South Africans trying to create their own political identity in a post-apartheid world where it's actually quite difficult to deliver all of the promises that they hoped for in the struggle against apartheid. In Ireland, you have Israel and Palestine being used as kind of symbolic ways of talking about orange and green politics. So it plays out differently in different countries.
My question was answered just now.
Fantastic.
It was about simply how Jeremy Corbyn can get away with his past, basically.
Yeah.
And his connections to Hamas and Hezbollah.
Yeah.
And how the British left can get away with it.
And all the crimes.
Say again.
And the connections to all the crimes. The 9/11 through the...
Yeah. Did someone have their hand up at the back there? Yes.
I have a question for you concerning the multimedia offensive, how I would call it, with like Al Jazeera and Press TV, as you mentioned, in Russia Today. There was like a documentation on the Labour Party's Friends of Israel movement and how this works out, because especially Al Jazeera is covering itself as a serious news outlet and producing documentaries and playing with like appearing seriously. How is your take on that?
When you ask that question, are you aware about my own involvement in that story? Okay, I'll tell the story. So I did a presentation in the British Parliament for Labour Friends of Israel. It was a panel, there were 4 of us or something. And as I was walking out, a guy came up to me, actually a German guy, and I was with my wife who speaks German, and he kind of made friends. He said, I was really interested in what you had to say, and I'm interested in building, helping Labour Friends of Israel. Can I come and talk to you? And I said, yeah, sure. I gave him a card, he emailed me. Sometime later, he came to talk to me, he sat with me at my university. We talked for quite a long time. We had lunch, and then he said he wanted to smoke, so he took me outside, kind of quite near the road, and we talked some more, and I forgot about him. And then something like 6 months later, a colleague of mine phoned me up and said, actually, this guy was working for Al Jazeera, and he was an undercover journalist. He was a kind of spy for Al Jazeera. And he was trying to do an expose on the Israel lobby. So the program wanted to prove that Israel pretends to be a kind of indigenous British political movement, but actually it's Israel which goes into the Labour Party and tries to attack Jeremy Corbyn. And I'm thinking, oh no, I'm thinking, what did I say to this guy over lunch and over a cigarette? Did I say anything stupid? Did I show off a little bit? Did I make a joke which wouldn't look good in public? I was actually quite worried. What did I do? And, you know me by now, I don't say stupid things very much, but I was kind of worried. And then this 4-part documentary came out on Al Jazeera, and I watched it kind of a bit nervous. And actually, I wasn't in it at all. So I think that means that I didn't say anything that was any use to them. In fact, what I do remember saying is that he asked me about lobbying and Israel's influence, and I said, well, look, whatever you do politically, you get accused of being a spy for Israel anyway. So don't worry about it. And they didn't want to use that in their documentary. They wanted to prove that Israel was intervening into the Labour Party and into British politics. And of course, Jeremy Corbyn used that, and he said we need an inquiry into Israel's lobbying in the British state. Not the first time he's done it, actually. He asked, some time ago, he wanted an inquiry into Israel lobbying in the Foreign Office in Britain. So the answer to your question is, I don't know what the answer to your question is. There's a lot of discussion about Russia today. Jeremy Corbyn has also promoted Russia today. Not only him, a whole number of members of parliament, also a whole number of kind of neo-fascists. Russia today's programme really is to try to delegitimise democracy, to try to delegitimise the European Union, to try to delegitimise American democracy. So when Donald Trump comes along and he says everything's fake news, and he says democratic politics is just a con to steal your money, that's the kind of politics that Russia today wants to push. And it's, in my view, quite dangerous. I might say a little more about the rise of populism, because what I'm talking about with the rise of Corbyn really is a rise of populism. And kind of astonishingly, in the last 2 years, really recently, populism on the right has suddenly flown into the mainstream. First in Britain with the Brexit vote, with the rise of Le Pen and the rise of Geert Wilders and the rise of the AfD in Germany, and with the kind of astonishing victory of Donald Trump. And it seems to me that the success of Jeremy Corbyn can't be understood independently of the crisis on the British right, as well as on the British left, and to do with Brexit, and to do with the mainstreaming of ideas of xenophobia and blaming foreigners, which only a few years ago were much more marginal. The Brexit vote wasn't only about foreigners, but it was a lot about foreigners, about Romanians and Poles coming over here, taking our jobs, corrupting our society, corrupting our community, and foreign bureaucrats over there, Germans and the French and the Belgians, telling us what to do and denying us our sovereignty. And those were kind of important but minority narratives, and suddenly they won it, and suddenly the new government came to power on the basis of putting it into action. And the last election in Britain is quite interesting, because Theresa May came along and she wasn't in favour of Brexit. She knows it's a disaster, and she said, look, you voted for Brexit, okay, I'll give you a Brexit. I'll give you a strong and stable Brexit. I'll try to minimise the harm. I'll give you as a kind of least damaging Brexit that I can possibly deliver you. And the people of Britain just laughed at her, and they said, we didn't want strong and stable, we wanted to kick the grown-ups. We wanted to embrace a politics of kind of radical rebellion, a politics of resentment, a politics of blaming the foreigners, of anger with the big cities, of anger with politics, of anger with fake news. That's what we wanted, and we're not going to vote for you, we're going to vote for him. And that's why Jeremy Corbyn did so well in the last election. Although, in the end, May wanted a big mandate for Brexit and Corbyn wanted to be Prime Minister, and neither of them really got what they wanted. And I think there are also a lot of parallels with the rise of Trump in the United States. Yeah.
I was wondering about a different topic. You briefly mentioned anti-racism there, and I wonder how far anti-racist activity can be complicit in anti-Semitism, because of course, in misguided anti-racism, because in some ways I think it can be
Okay,
so it's like for modern anti-Semitism.
Yeah. Well, it's really strange because what we're seeing suddenly is quite a sensitivity on the left to right-wing anti-Semitism. And the left sees Charlottesville and the marching of the Nazis in America and Steve Bannon in the White House. And the left says, there's a problem of anti-Semitism on the right. It's gone mainstream. It's not explicit, but we can see it anyway. There are dog whistles. There's conspiracy theory. The left has suddenly become very sensitive to seeing anti-Semitism on the right. And the right has suddenly become really sensitive to seeing anti-Semitism on the left. And it sees Corbyn and Livingston and Linda Sarsour and BDS. And the right goes, the real problem of anti-Semitism is over there on the left. And the left says the real problem of anti-Semitism is over there on the right. And nobody can see the anti-Semitism within their own political community. It's become a symbolic issue. It's become an issue which is symbolic of the rottenness of the community that you hate anyway, the right or the left. That wasn't quite your question, was it? Your question was about how anti-racists can be bearers of an anti-Semitic politics. Also, on the right, we see how racists and Islamophobes can be more and more positioning themselves as kind of supporters of Israel. And people who kind of admire Israel because they think Israel deals with the Muslims really strongly. So I think it's all quite complicated. Yeah.
Do you think that in a perverse way it's possible that Corbyn could be a kind of blessing in disguise? I mean, his ascendancy has obviously galvanised all of the like Gallowayist elements and moved them into the mainstream in the Labour Party and left-wing politics generally. And at the moment, his tactic when anti-Semitism comes up in the Labour Party is never to condemn it in isolation, because that would alienate the movement that is mobilising against the party, basically. But suddenly, since the election, it seems like the supposedly impossible is now possible, and he could be on the brink of power.
Yeah.
I know maybe it's naive, but it seems to me that the closer it gets to power, and if he actually comes into power as a result of Brexit chaos, when issues like, for example, Naz Khan come up, they're going to have to take a more explicit stand. I just can't see a cabinet with someone like, say, Diane Abbott in it, and not coming out and condemning it in more straightforward terms.
Yeah.
I mean, even at the moment, someone like Livingston, he wasn't exactly paraded around the Labour conference. It seems like in, let's say, the respectable left-wing press, say Guardian, New Statesman, he's already persona non grata.
The answer is no. I think. I remember in the 80s, people on the left saying, isn't Margaret Thatcher really brilliant? Because Margaret Thatcher is a naked, right-wing, pro-capitalist class fighter, and isn't it really great that everybody can really see now what's happening, and the working class will kind of realise, that the capitalist system isn't any more hidden, but now it's explicit. And I've always been really suspicious of this notion that as long as things come out into the mainstream and are really clear, then we can deal with them. I think I mean, I think it's clear. So let me ask the question in this way, and I think it's a really difficult question. What would be the effect of having Jeremy Corbyn in number 10 Downing Street? What would be the effect of having somebody as Prime Minister of Britain who for the last 3, 4, 5 decades has been implicated in Stalinist and in anti-Semitic and in other kinds of disgraceful politics? And it's not an easy question to answer. You know, he's not going to start shipping Jews off to the east. That's not who he is. So what will happen? I mean, you can think of all sorts of concrete things which might happen. You know, Britain will maybe be more anti-Israel and BDS will be more strong and all sorts of things. But none of those are really what worries me. What worries me is the kind of emergence of this kind of politics and these kinds of ways of thinking into the mainstream. And they have emerged into the mainstream. And there's absolutely no reason why Diane Abbott wouldn't be in the cabinet, along with a whole number of other people. And Britain, and possibly Europe, and possibly the United States, is sailing into what may be real crisis. Brexit is not going to go well. And the harder the Tories push Brexit, the more likely they're going to get Corbyn. And the reason for that is very simple, because what Corbyn is a kind of empty cipher. Corbyn was supported in the last election by the Brexiters in the north and by the anti-Brexiters in London. And at the moment, Corbyn is saying, of course we respect the democratic decision of the British people to go with Brexit, and in fact Corbyn has supported Brexit for 40 years as well. But he's also saying we're going to give you a lovely Brexit, a workers' Brexit, a Brexit for the poor, a Brexit for the many, not the few. We're going to give you the single market, we're going to give you the customs union, we're going to give you peace in Ireland. So he's basically promising the European Union to the London Remainers, and he's promising Brexit to the northern Brexiters. So he might well win. And I think there's a whole number of really concrete worries that will put onto the agenda immediately. But the bigger worry is that things are going to go wrong. Corbyn is not going to be a success. Brexit is not going to be a success. And there's going to be a need for people to blame. And we've already seen this construction, this kind of actually ancient construction of the white working class being against the cosmopolitan elites. And more we're seeing racism or anti-Semitism as being interpreted as the cry of the oppressed, right? The white working class in Michigan in the Rust Belt embracing Trump's anti-Muslim, anti-Mexican stuff. The so-called left behinds in Sunderland embracing the anti-Polish and anti-Romanian stuff. The Palestinians embracing an anti-Semitic politics. So racism and anti-Semitism is being seen as the cry of the oppressed, and anti-racism and anti-anti-Semitism is being constructed as a discourse of power created by Hillary and Blair and the cosmopolitan elite and the anti-racists to keep the oppressed quiet. So there's another weird kind of reversal that I find really worrying. Yeah.
You already talked on this, but my question would be to you, what is your take on the motivation of anti-Semitic people? Is it like a strategic lie, or are they really that lunatic and they contort the whole reality with talking about that it's a libel to be called an anti-Semite when everybody is critical of Israel, like constructing this self-humanization, and the same with the Nazis working together with Zionists in the 30s, when you had, in fact, an explicit Muslim SS division in Bosnia.
Yeah.
What purpose do you see in the anti-Semitic trope for those people?
Yeah, no, I don't think it's a lie. I think that people like Jeremy Corbyn Corbyn is not a cynic. He's not a cynical kind of gatherer of votes. He's never had anyone vote for him in his whole life, actually. He's not a cynic. He's a true believer. And a true believer is much more frightening. And he doesn't believe he's anti-Semitic at all. He's really angry that the Zionists tried to smear him and tried to get rid of him by accusing him of this thing which he so patently is not guilty of. And I think we have to understand part of the power of it and part of the self-confidence of it is that it's not conscious. I also think that we need to really understand anti-Semitism as something which is objective and cultural and political rather than being kind of a moral failing within the individual. So people often, this time of the talk, near the end of the talk, they say to me, so, is Corbyn really an anti-Semite? And it's not a question that even interests me, actually. I mean, I don't think he is in the sense that I don't think he believes that he hates Jews, but I do think he fights for an anti-Semitic politics, and if somebody who fights for an anti-Semitic politics is an anti-Semite, that's fine by me, then he's an anti-Semite. But that's not the key question. The key question is, what is the politics that he's playing with and licensing and legitimising? And that's what worries me. How are we doing for time? Are you going to let me go home soon? Or do you all want me to let you go home soon?
You decide.
Who else got their hand up? Somebody who hasn't spoke. Any women want to speak? There have not been many women speak yet. Go on. Anyone who hasn't spoken yet? Yes.
Maybe you already covered this, but I was just wondering what you were going to say with this awful Daily Mail from that I saw. Maybe
yes, I have already covered that. Let me just read this little bit because it's what I just said, but maybe in a more kind of clear and succinct way. Anti-Semitism, xenophobia and racism have been re-described by the populists, both left and right, as modes of rebellion by the oppressed, whether it be conceived as white working class or as supporters of the Palestinians or as the left behinds. While anti-racism has been portrayed as a mode of domination, a dishonest discourse of power which functions to silence the organic rebellion of the oppressed. Those embracing such anti-racism have been delegitimised by the use of terms such as cosmopolitan elite, and they have been thus cast as unpatriotic or even as enemies of the people. This headline was from a right-wing newspaper. There was a rather technical court case about whether Parliament would have to vote in order to begin the Brexit process, and the Daily Mail got really angry and it expressed its anger like this: enemies of the people. And if really the kind of political illiteracy of that, if people understood the force and the history and the violence of the accusation of enemies of the people, it's kind of mind-blowing that they are happy to just resurrect that kind of way of thinking. And, these are High Court judges. One of the judges was gay, and the Daily Mail made a big thing about that and connected it to the idea of the cosmopolitan elite, who were trying to basically prevent the oppressed and the left behinds from implementing their Brexit. In Germany, there was a history of this. When people raised the issue of anti-Semitism in the early 1930s in Germany, they were often told, why are you concerned about the Jews? Why are you concerned about the cosmopolitan elite in Berlin? Why aren't you concerned about ordinary, decent German workers? And this kind of splitting into white, working class and cosmopolitan elite is also really, really worrying. And if people had any kind of understanding of the history of these ideas of enemy of the people, then they wouldn't do it. But of course, enemy of the people is where I started, with Moishe Machover and Len McCluskey saying that the people in the Labour Party are enemies of the people. They are the people in the Labour Party who worry about anti-Semitism, and not really people who belong on the left, and not really even people who are indigenous to British politics, but they're from outside and they're our enemies, and that's how we should think of them. So again, the populist discourses kind of mirror each other and kind of require each other. Corbyn wouldn't have done so well in the last election if the Tory party wasn't also in crisis, and if Britain wasn't in a political crisis, I think. Okay. Thank you very, very much for inviting me.